Hi. So this is titled January 2017. By nighttime, he had already fallen asleep, and although doctors tried to think of ways to help him, they knew his heart would only continue beating for a few more hours. My mother was convinced he would wake up any minute. She refused to allow the idea of her 26-year-old son dying before her. Her small body paced back and forth our railroad apartment. She would go to the kitchen and grab an apple from the plate on the counter just to put it back and take a piece of bread instead. She would go to her bedroom and rearrange her perfumes and then make her way back to the kitchen. She held her phone close to her the whole time, saying, "I don't feel his soul leaving Earth. He can't be dying." She would look around the living room and the kitchen as if expecting to see a sign that my brother's soul was there. But hours passed, and she felt nothing. My mother believes that when someone is on the verge of death, and even after they're dead, their soul wanders to all of the places that were once special to them. Growing up, my mother had heard stories from her mother and grandmother of people's presence being felt behind them as they walked through the night. Shadows seen running around the house, things winding up in unexpected locations, right around the time when someone died. So she expected a sign all along. Despite my brother's condition getting worse and worse each day, she never felt or saw his soul in our house. She never got a sign. I don't know if perhaps my body sensed what was coming or if it was just a cold winter weighing me down. But during those first weeks of January, I felt as if I had been walking around with rocks in my backpack for days. I couldn't fall asleep at night, but I couldn't get up in the morning. I could barely eat, but I was always hungry. This went on for days, and typically I would just blame the weather. But this time around, the exhaustion felt much too heavy. During those days, my younger sister had developed a fear of the dark again. I would send her off to bed while I stayed up doing homework in the living room. The light from the living room always bothered her, so she would close the door to her room. However, during those days, she refused to go to sleep alone, and she refused to shut the door. She claimed she was afraid of the dark, and I simply thought she was making up an excuse to stay up past her bedtime. She had no idea how bad her brother was getting. She was kept in the dark about that to avoid scaring her, or maybe to avoid scaring us, the adults. Nonetheless, her behavior made sense to my mother once my brother died. My sister's room had been my brother's when he was still living with us. It's where he spent most of his time whenever he was home, which was not very often. But all along, as my sister struggled to fall asleep those nights, his soul had been there, visiting, reminiscing. On the day that he was admitted to the hospital, my mother could barely speak. She could not sit still, but she would not look us in the eyes or speak to us either. She would spend most of her time in the kitchen, looking up at the small altar my father had mounted on the wall with statues of Jesus Christ and other saints he believes in. I believe she was praying for a miracle. Being in an entirely different country from the one where her son was dying from cancer made it difficult for her to cope. Hours passed, and he still wasn't making any progress. The doctors and nurses that admitted him to the hospital had all been surprised to see that my brother had been able to last that long without any white blood cells. They said his white blood cell count had reached an all-time low a month ago, and it was a miracle he had been able to live that long while being exposed to so many toxins in the air every day. Perhaps that had been the real miracle my mother had longed for. My mother, father, and I fell asleep in the living room carpet as we waited for an update on my brother's condition. I woke up at 4 a.m. to my mother's loud cries over the phone, saying, "He's dead. My son is dead." I hugged her tight as she continued to cry inconsolably. My father's eyes were bloodshot red from crying, but he maintained his composure to be able to hold my mother. I struggled to cry, still in disbelief that I was not going to see my brother again. But as I watched my mother call her sister and close friends to tell them the news, tears rolled down my face, and my face began to feel really hot. My mother continued to call person after person while we sat there, not looking at each other, while the sun crept up into the sky, while my sister slept in her room with the blinds shut, still in the dark. My father was the first to stand up. He woke my sister up and told her to get ready for school. When she came to the living room, she saw my mother and I still crying on the carpet. She hugged us first, and then asked why we were crying. As my mother explained to her that her brother died, she began to cry. But she was actually crying because she had never seen our mother cry. She had been much too young when our brother went to Mexico. One by one, family and friends began arriving to offer their condolences. Everyone said something different, but it all sounded the same. None of it was actually comforting. Until someone pointed out all of the major milestones in my brother's life. He crossed the border when he was 13. He spent 3 months in jail when he was 20. He was deported when he was 21, and later spent a few months in rehab. He got married and built his house when he was 23 and had 2 sons soon after. There was much more he wanted to accomplish, but by the age of 26, he had managed to meet most of his major milestones, and that gave me and my mother some comfort. My brother had once said he lived every day as if it were his last because he refused to live with regrets. It was this kind of thinking that led to our separation, and yet we could forgive him now. Deep down, he sensed it all along. Deep down, he knew he wouldn't have much time. My brother's death brought us closer as a family, and we had never felt closer to him than we did after he died.